Okay, today we're going to talk about renewable energy and carbon policy. So, the three quasi final exam questions for today are: what are the different ways that governments support the development of renewable energy? What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of a carbon tax versus a cap and trade system? And what levels of public support do renewable energy and carbon policy have today in the United States? So, first, let's start with a brief overview of renewable energy policy in the United States. And so the first question is: what was arguably the first federal renewable energy policy in the US? So I'm asking this because it's actually something that we've seen before. We came across this in our discussion of the history of the electric power industry. So it was actually PURPA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act, that was enacted by Congress in 1978, ostensibly to encourage more energy efficient and environmentally friendly commercial energy production. So remember the historical context of when PURPA was enacted by Congress. The United States had gone through two different oil crises, at least one in 1973 before PURPA was enacted, and then another one later in the decade. And this caused energy prices, not necessarily electricity prices, but certainly for transportation fuel, to skyrocket. And so Americans and the American government were sensitive about the U.S. vulnerability to shocks to energy systems and the potential for high energy prices and the dependence on foreign sources of energy to be a vulnerability economically as well. And so we talked about PURPA in the context of how it changed who could own and produce electric power generation. Now, before PURPA was enacted, only utilities acting as load-serving entities, which were essentially utilities, vertically integrated, regulated monopoly utilities, who were delivering power to retail customers, could own and operate power plants. Not anybody could just decide to build and operate one. This was part of the monopoly consensus. The rationale was that if we only allowed a few companies to build electric power plants and to sell electricity to end use customers, that would reduce redundancies in the system. We wouldn't have lots of different utilities building infrastructure and building more infrastructure than we actually need. It would allow us to take advantage of economies of scale. So one utility could potentially build and operate lots of power plants more cost effectively than lots of different utilities building the same amount of capacity and operating them separately. And the whole point here, if you remember, with the monopoly consensus was to keep prices low for customers. The rationale was that by regulating utilities as monopolies, that was the best way to make sure that the price of electricity was low. After PURPA, what we had is a world in which independent or non-utility power producers were in some cases allowed to operate, to build electric power plants and to sell electricity. And so more specifically, what PURPA did is it obligated load-serving entities or the incumbent utilities to sign long-term contracts to buy power from what were called qualifying facilities. So these were owned by independent power producers. Mostly they were factories or mills that produced smaller amounts of electricity for their own needs, but might have surplus. So before PURPA, that surplus generation might not have an end use or an end point of consumption. They might have to just send it to ground and waste it. After PURPA, they were able to sell that electricity to end use utilities or to load-serving entities or utilities and sell, who then sold that electricity to end-use customers. So the goal of PURPA was really to make sure we weren't wasting cheap electricity or surplus electricity that was produced by some third-party generators. Its big impact, though, at least if we think about it today, was to allow entities other than the monopoly utilities to participate. This was really important for the future of electricity markets. It also opened the door for renewable energy providers who were considered to be qualifying facilities. Even though they weren't really cost effective at the time, we didn't see on the heels of PURPA a lot of for example, wind power producers and solar power producers popping up all over the United States. And that's because those technologies were too costly at the time. But PURPA still exists today, and in some regions, it is one of the main driving forces for the uptake and development of renewable energy in the United States. So these two figures show how much capacity in terms of solar, photovoltaic, and onshore wind in the United States has been added over the last several years as a result of PURPA. So the top figure shows capacity additions of solar on the left and onshore wind on the right. And you see two colors for each technology. The light yellow and the light blue represent non-qualifying facilities. So those are probably very large solar and very large onshore wind facilities. And then the darker colors, brown in the case of solar and dark blue in the case of wind, represent facilities that are qualifying for under the PURPA Act. So these would be smaller solar farms and wind farms that are regarded as qualifying facilities and whose generation electric utilities are legally obligated to buy and then distribute that to end use customers. And the bottom figure actually shows the breakdown by state. And we talked a little bit before about how North Carolina is one of the leading states in the U.S. in terms of installed solar power capacity, but that most of that, almost all of it actually, is utility scale solar. So we have very little rooftop solar in North Carolina. A lot of that is because we have cheap electricity prices, so it doesn't really make sense for customers to go solar individually. But you do see that North Carolina, almost all of its capacity at this point is qualifies under PURPA. So we have a lot of smaller scale solar farms that Duke Energy, because they are the load serving entity for the state, is legally obligated to buy. Now, they're not necessarily legally obligated to buy it at a certain price, and that is somewhat negotiable, and Duke can influence that. And make things more or less attractive for developers in the state. But up until now, a lot of the solar in North Carolina has fallen under PURPA. So the way this would work in a state like North Carolina is that a qualifying facility would be built by often a developer, so a utility scale solar developer like Strata Solar or Cypress Creek Renewables. And all the electricity that solar farm produces would then be sold to Duke Energy for some sort of price. And now that price is somewhat negotiable, but in a lot of cases, historically, the solar developers and Duke Energy have entered into a long-term agreement called a power purchase agreement. And so what this does is it is a contract that stipulates that Duke Energy will buy all the electricity from the solar farm and will pay the solar farm in exchange a certain rate in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. And then Duke Energy incorporates that solar energy that's produced at the solar farm in its own generation portfolio and uses that solar power to help meet the demand of its retail customers, who are then paying Duke Energy the retail rate for electricity. So other drivers of growth in renewable energy in the United States include renewable energy portfolio standards. So these are regulatory requirements that stipulate that utilities have to meet a certain amount of electricity demand via renewable energy. And so this gives you a sense for how many states in the U.S. Have renewable energy portfolio standards. The green states are ones that have legally binding requirements. Light green or dark green have legally binding requirements. Light green have voluntary requirements, and gray have no targets. And I've also made a note here that North Carolina is a state that has a legally binding renewable energy portfolio standard. So Duke has to meet 12.5% of all the electricity demand that it serves using renewable energy by 2021. So this also gives you a sense for some of the targets in other states that are more aggressive than North Carolina. We see targets here by Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, and Washington, D.C. The light green represent previous targets that had been enacted, and the dark green represent more recent targets that have been enacted. And really the standout here, both in terms of its ambition and in terms of the size of the state and the volume of electricity we're talking about, is California. So California has recently signed a bill. So the state government of California has signed a bill aiming to meet 100% of all electricity in California by renewable or zero carbon energy by 2045. And interestingly, in California, the renewable energy portfolio standard also extends to grid scale energy storage. The state rightfully, I think, acknowledges that in order to meet such a high level of electricity demand, a high percentage of the state's electricity demand using probably wind and solar, they're going to have to also incorporate grid scale energy storage. And so, as part of the state's 100% renewable energy by 2045 target, the state is also aiming to install 1.3 gigawatts. So that's 1,300 megawatts of energy storage across its different incumbent utility footprints. So that would be Southern California Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric, and San Diego Gas and Electric. So that amount of storage has to be installed by 2020. And so a big reason for that need for storage in California is because of the increased reliance of the state and the state's utilities on solar power. And that has created a situation that we sort of commonly refer to as the duck curve. And that's what's shown here because of its visual resemblance to a duck. And so what we see is that these different colored lines represent different years. And the lines, what we're looking at here, are net demand for electricity in California. So that's demand for electricity by retail consumers minus the availability of renewable energy. So the more solar power the state installs, the more solar power that's available during the middle part of the day. And so net demand for electricity actually decreases in that middle part of the day, not because consumers are using less electricity, but that's because there's more solar available. And so less demand needs to be met using other dispatchable sources of generation like natural gas or hydropower. And so what that creates is a situation where net demand for electricity gets really, really low during the periods of the day when the sun is shining. And so this creates some problems. It creates very low prices for electricity during the middle part of the day. It also creates sort of a sudden need for increased generation as soon as the sun goes down. And so part of the idea with installing more solar or more energy storage in the state is to use that storage to help absorb that excess solar or the abundant solar during the middle part of the day and store that energy until a later period of the day when demand is higher, when electricity is more valuable. So other drivers of growth in renewable energy are government incentives. So one of the main policy levers that the federal government has used historically to promote the development of renewable energy is tax policy. And so taking advantage of these tax breaks can actually be really complicated. And what we're not going to do much in this class is talk about taxes. I thought I would spare you. But we are going to briefly talk about the two different types of tax benefits that renewable energy providers can take advantage of. The first is the production tax credit, or PTC, and the second is the investment tax credit, or ITC. So all firms, so businesses, utilities, renewable energy developers, et cetera, pay taxes on the profits that they make. So again, profits are revenues minus costs. And the taxes, in a really simplified way, we can think of the taxes, the amount of taxes that they pay to the federal government are proportional to the profits that they make. So the more profits you make, the higher taxes you're going to make, but also a tax rate, so some sort of percentage. So we could think of the amount of taxes that a renewable energy developer would pay would be their profits times some sort of predefined tax rate or percentage. What tax credits do is they provide a dollar for dollar reduction of a firm's tax liability. So let's take a look at how these work. So we're going to assume that the amount of taxes that a firm owes is the maximum between two quantities. First, the profits times the tax rate, a percentage, minus the tax credit, and zero, right? So what that effectively means is that a firm can't pay negative taxes, which means it can't make money using tax credits, right? So what that is suggesting that if a renewable energy developer's profits were really, really low, and they were in line to receive a tax credit, that they might not actually be able to use all of the tax credit. They would just pay zero taxes, but they wouldn't actually somehow make a profit from the federal government in the form of a tax credit. So a tax credit, in this case, subtracts from the actual taxes that a firm is scheduled to pay, but it can't actually make your taxes go negative. So the federal production tax credit is a tax credit that accrues to the project owner, so whoever owns and operates the wind farm or the solar farm, based on energy output. And for wind, geothermal, and closed-loop biomass, the federal production tax credit was about 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour, and then 1.1 cents per kilowatt hour for other eligible technologies. And so this generally applies to the first 10 years of operation. The other type of tax credit is the federal investment tax credit, or ITC. And so this accrues to the project owner based on installation expenditures. So for solar in particular, the investment tax credit would make available a tax credit to the owners of solar farms equal to 30% of essentially the capital cost of the solar farm. So historically, these tax credits have been really important for driving growth in renewable energy. And a nice example of that, that's a nice visual example of that, is shown here. This shows annual U.S. wind power installation. And so you see really strong growth starting in 2005, going through about 2012. And then you see this really steep drop in 2013. And that's because, for political reasons in some cases, there was this temporary expiration of the production tax credit for wind power producers. And what that meant is that every wind power producer or wind farm that was built in 2013 would not actually receive the tax credit. And then once the tax credit was reinstated in 2014, as you can clearly see, the volume of wind power capacity that was installed ramped right back up again. But today, I think the collective decision has been made that both wind and solar are cost competitive without government support. The goal all along in supporting these technologies using tax incentives was to help develop the industries, to get financial institutions more comfortable lending money to solar farms and wind farms, to increase the efficiency of the supply chain, to help the industry realize economies of scale, to push for more cost-effective materials. All of these things have led to a decrease in the cost of renewable energy, to the point that the federal government now believes, and I think most people agree, that tax credits are not necessary to increase the amount of renewable energy we have in the grid. Now, whether it's enough, whether these technologies are competitive enough by themselves to get to 100% or even greater than 50% of energy that's used on the grid is sort of an open question, and we'll talk about. And we'll talk about other policies that might be needed a little later in this lecture. But as of today, the plan is to completely wind down the production tax credits for wind power producers and investment tax credits by 2020, so that any wind farm that's built in the United States after January 1st would not experience tax credits, and solar tax credits are winding down as well.